Her books, Recycling for Death, A Social History of Ancient Egypt Through Coffins of Dynasties 19 to 22 from American University in Cairo Press, and Ancient Egyptian Society, Challenging Assumptions, Exploring Approaches from Routledge are forthcoming. The title of her talk today is The Good Kings, Absolute Power in Ancient Egypt and the Modern World. Dr. Cooney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Megan. Thank you, Sasa. I'm a little jet lagged coming from Hawaii on a red eye, but this is going to be great. And I think this keynote in many ways follows up on what you were talking about in your workshop quite directly in terms of speaking to the public, leaving the ivory tower, having conversations with a larger audience, and making ancient history as relevant as possible. And as we go through many of the changes in the world around us today, I think that all of us can see how very relevant ancient history actually is. So let's jump into that, and I'll keep this to 30 minutes, she said confidently, so that we can have a vibrant Q&A discussion. So I think we all know that in the ancient world, it was an easy thing to divinize rulers. Perhaps it was easier in ancient Egypt than in any other place, and more on that in a moment. But even those places that profess to hate the divinization of rulers, the connection between politics and religion in such an overt way, even these other places found methods of divinizing their rulers, whether explicitly or implicitly. And that's of great interest to me. But Egypt, I think, excels in the optics and packaging of that divinization, of that connection between state and God, in a way that no one else on the entire planet to this day has been able to do. They are able to present themselves as the good and perfect king, as the one who, sorry, that was a call from my son, the good, and he may do it again, so we'll just keep coming back and I'll keep declining that call. But the good and perfect king who is the one who connects the earth with the heavens, who is the one who knows literally in the Egyptian hieroglyphs how to do things. The Yirat Hut is the Egyptian for the ritualist, the chief ritualist. He knows how to make the offerings, as you see here, to light the brazier, to make things happen in the world as they should. He is the one that keeps your world safe. He keeps it protected. He is your last best hope between absolute chaos and all of the other bad things that could happen without a king. And ancient Egypt excelled in producing pessimistic literature of what the world would be like without a king. So there's positivism presented, there's fear-mongering presented, but really the way this divine state is packaged is something that continues to draw our gaze, to make us be Pharaoh's groupies, as I call it in the book. And really that's going to be our starting point for how this is actually very relevant for us in, I apologize, that's my son again. I knew he would call again because that's what he does. Yeah, so this slide is probably my most controversial slide. So you think you don't have a king? What is the rise of authoritarianism? How are we to understand this? How can I jump from ancient Egypt to modern American politics? Should I even be doing this? What is this discussion? Well, you can read the book and decide for yourself, but I do go back and forth between ancient authoritarianism and modern authoritarianism, with the overt claim that modern exceptionalism is a myth, with the overt claim that what the ancient Egyptians did so well, we would love to do better, or many of us would love to do better, and that much of our democratic system is based on the very same divinization, this idea that some presidents deserve to be carved into the sides of mountains sacred to indigenous peoples, whereas others do not. But we do divinize our rulers as well. And we engage in many of the same practices that the ancient Egyptians do. And this is the book. The title is The Good Kings, Absolute Power in the Ancient World in the Modern Day. And I'm trying to get to a particular slide, this one here, where we may think we don't have these strange ideologies. We may think that we don't have this packaging of church and state. We may think that that we're absolutely separate from this way of propagandizing power in the ancient world. But this is exactly why I use Egypt. I apologize. Egypt is about as recognizable as you could possibly get. It's also something that you see very quickly. You see its strangeness. You see the crooks and the flails. Okay, sorry. Jules, I'm in a talk. I'm in a public talk right now in front of a whole lot of people. Can I call you back? It's okay. I'll call you back as soon as I can. I'm so sorry. I love you. Okay, bye.
Dr. Cooney, my 4-year-old photobombed us earlier, so you're just fine. It's
his first day of school and new school, and so
oh bless.
And he's just like, it's just a school thing. So I'll try to focus, and then I'll come back. we'll keep it together. It's going to be okay. So getting back to our topic at hand, the Egyptians are so recognizable that it makes it obvious to us what's going on. So that when you see a king standing before a god with a lit brazier, claiming that he's the only one that can keep you safe, you might roll your eyes and look at it and say that we would never do such a thing here. But my point is that this strange ideology was not strange to the Egyptians. These iconographies, elements, symbols were all pulled from the world around them, from their geography, from their flora and fauna. This was the water in which they swam. And to them, this ideology was able to hide and veil how politics was propagandized and how their authoritarianism actually worked. I would argue that in the modern world, that what we call a democracy and much of the constitutional idealisms that we create, particularly in the United States, are ideologies as well. That they're veiling the pay-to-play economics of our politics, that they veil how state and religion are actually quite intertwined in politics around the world. They veil how many places are actually authoritarian. To get money from the IMF, to get money from UNESCO or other organizations, you must claim to have free and fair elections. And there are many states around this globe that claim to be democracies when in actuality, they're authoritarian regimes. And there are democracies that have presidents or parliamentary rulers who are authoritarian personalities. So the point is that Egypt is there to jar us and make us wake up and see something for what it is. And we can see it with Egypt. And then I turn our gaze back to the United States, sometimes to modern day Egypt, other places, and say, look at it there. Now try to pull the veil from your eyes, try to see it for what it actually is. And then you can take a lot of the positivist tropes away from your history. I would argue that there is no more positivist history of the ancient world except for ancient Egypt, maybe ancient Rome, particularly in its connection to the United States and its political rubrics and schema. But we glorify these Egyptian kings. We feel no shame in creating blockbuster exhibitions, in consuming the treasures of dead kings with our eyes and our coffee table books. These things are very positivized in our eyes, and that's part of what I'm trying to tear down. And you can imagine that this doesn't always work well with some of my colleagues. But in short, we're going to go back to the Egyptian kingship, and I'm going to give you some elements of the Egyptian kingship and how it is authoritarian and how it works. Most of this should be no surprise to any of you, but it sometimes is jarring to people who spend their lives dedicated to this ancient field. And then we'll talk about a few kings and some of the parallels that we might make to the modern world, and just some of the patterns that we have in this system of authoritarianism that humans seem to turn to with such regularity. The first point would be the king is superhuman. He's not just a god, but he is a human being of flesh and blood that is different from other people's. He is colossal. He is precious stones. He is something unusual. He is superhuman. And he is monumental. He can be depicted as a building. He can be depicted as a temple. He can be depicted in colossal statuary. He is greatness defined. And that is why so many Egyptian kings are called the Great, right? Ramses the Great, I think, is the case in point, and we'll certainly end with him. There is a great continuity to these kings, and they pride themselves on being able to say that they exist in this world from the beginning, and they will continue to its end, that they rule for millions of years. And while that may not actually be the case, the continuity that the Egyptian kingship was able to create, some 3,000 years of the same language, the same general culture, the same religion, same political system, is astounding to us and rather seductive. Something that we would, in many ways, love to take on instead of this ups and downs and parties and who knows who's going to be ruling and all of this competition. It can be quite exhausting. And this continuity is something that is quite alluring for many of us. This king's divine body, we've already discussed, but it gets quite explicit in some of the mythologies where the king claims clearly and directly to have been of a body possessed, his father's body was possessed by Amen-Re, impregnated his mother with actual divine seed, and his body is of that divine seed. And there's complex mythologies that go back probably to the Middle Kingdom, 12th dynasty, to make these claims of divination in physical corporeal form. There is a justified brutality, a monopolization of that brutality, that the king is the one who is meant to hold the mace aloft to smash the skulls of enemies. It is only the king who is supposed to be doing something like that. He is depicted larger. He is the one whose brutality is God-given, is accepted and expected by the heavens. This is something that keeps all Egyptians safe. He is the stereotypical strong leader in body as well. And of course, we have to put Putin on horseback because it fits perfectly with the image of a shirtless Tutmos III to the right. And even if you're not of sound body, like Roosevelt, who got polio as a young adult, you can still make yourself of sound body, put yourself behind the wheel of a car, give yourself agency to be able to drive and show your power in a different way. There are ways of showing strength and youth, even if you are an older man. Would that women were able to create the same kinds of subterfuge in a patriarchy, but I have not seen it done successfully thus far. These patriarchal systems, and really is the first time we're bringing up the word patriarchy, the rule of the fathers, a system in which we still live, obviously, though I think many would try to say that we do not, because we've had this sexual revolution and all, and I'm speaking to you, but I would say that patriarchy is going quite strong and is cracking down on many liberties that have been grasped by the people at the grassroots of society today. But these elite patriarchal systems, they serve themselves and they commodify and maintain their power through partnerships with other elite men. And these elite men connect with each other, have control of their women and their children and their families in a hierarchical way. And very much, the kingship is very much a balance between himself, his palace, and his elites. And that's a lot of what the book I was writing was about. Now, these authoritarian kings, they do seduce us, and the discovery of their treasures, their gold, their fabulous wealth, their coffins of 269 pounds of solid gold, and we're here on the centennial of King Tut's discovery. These things are very much in the news. We don't necessarily question this. We just assume, yes, a king is supposed to have this much gold. Yes, this is something that we will then put into our museums and share with the public. And very rarely do we actually bring up a critique of the hoarding of all of this excessive wealth in any sort of way beyond the simplistic. So I discussed 5 kings in the book, The Good Kings, and we'll only be looking at 4 of them here today, and I have some 14 minutes left, so we'll be flying through. But the book exists in an article in Sapiens, or 2, an excerpt is in Sapiens, and I wrote an op-ed in Sapiens about this book and the reception thereof, so you can check that out. It was a hot and controversial article, so do check out the Sapiens piece on the Good Kings. But let's jump into Khufu, the first and in some ways the most integral of our discussion, and we'll really focus the most on Khufu and Akhenaten, though Ramses II will come into play as well. Now, Khufu's pyramid is usually discussed as something that you build because you can, like Mount Everest is there, that's why you climb it. You climb it because it's there. And I would like to reframe this, and I'm not the first to have done this. This is John Baines who was the first to have done this, but to claim that you build the pyramid because you have to, because you must, because there is a need for a reinvestment in the propaganda of kingship. If some of you are worried about me using the word propaganda, I myself was skittish about it, but now I've gone all in and I'm using the word propaganda. We can discuss that too. But this pyramid, arguably in the fourth dynasty, not the first, not the second, not the third, it's built in the fourth, this straight-sided pyramid was built because the kings needed to reinvent themselves. They needed to become something bigger and grander than they had been before. And here you see the three attempts of Khufu's father, Sneferu, starting out with the bent pyramid at, the pyramid at Meidum, then the bent pyramid at Dashur, ending with the first straight-sided pyramid in human history, also at Dashur, known as the Red Pyramid. And this is then transformed into Khufu's well-known pyramid. We have Khafre there in the center, and then Menkaure, the smallest pyramid, in the group of three at Giza. And I go into much more close examination of the building of these pyramids, the reasons for building them, what they did to society. But let's suffice it to say that the pyramid, in my estimation, is a weapon, an ideological weapon of stone. It is a weapon on the mind, and it still works very well today, too well, I would say, so that you can turn on the History Channel and you can watch Ancient Aliens, and they'll tell you all about how pyramids can be used as electricity generating structures, as that they are not really burials, that the Atlanteans built them, that aliens built them, all of these different things. And while we may roll our eyes and call these theories racist, and all of these things are I validate all of them, it doesn't discount that if Khufu were looking down today, he would be like, ha, it's still working on their simple minds today, because it very much is. The building of the Great Pyramid was meant to do precisely that. It is meant to make people think that the person who built it, who ordered it, who constructed it, is beyond human, is superhuman, that this could not have been built by human hands. And what a functional thing that was. However, when Khufu built that pyramid, there were unintended consequences in so doing. And every time a king reaches an apex of power, we'll leave it here, there is a fall. And the seeds of the king's destruction, or the dynasty's destruction, are generally, in my opinion, sown at the very height of power, the most aggrandized, the most opulent, the most over the top. That's when the seeds of destruction are sown. Khufu is building this opulent, over the top, extraordinary structure, but in so doing, he must empower elites beyond anything that Egypt has ever seen. And some of those elites are related to him, some are new men. And these elites are now in the fourth and fifth dynasties, particularly in the fourth, showing themselves with personalities, with their own portrait, something that an Egyptian is not supposed to have, that only the king is meant to have. Only the king has a portrait that is recognizable and of a real person. Every other Egyptian gets some bland face X, face Y. You can see this on coffins, you can see it in tombs. They're not meant to represent the person. They don't deserve that. This elite empowerment that Khufu creates diminishes his kingship. And if you want, you can read Salin's engraver on this, that his kingship is so sacralized that he loses his power in the process of building that structure. So this is my point for Khufu, and we're going to move along to Senwosret III. I have like one main point for each of these guys, otherwise we'll never get out if you're alive. Senwosret III is a Middle Kingdom king, 12th dynasty, and really this is the apex of power of that Middle Kingdom. And the main point that I want to make with Senwosret III is how to reclaim his power from a number of recalcitrant elites who have gotten too powerful, as longue durée result perhaps of Khufu's building of the Great Pyramid, that he builds a new capital. And that capital city is called Ichitawi. He extends a new capital, because Amenemhet the first king of the 12th dynasty, was the one who started this new capital. But it was Senwosret III who really cracks down on the elites and makes them come to the new capital. He populates this new capital in a way that it had not been before. These provincial elites had their own fabulous tombs, their own outlook on the world. They were lined up along the Egyptian, upper Egyptian landscape, some ostensibly in the Delta, though we have less evidence for them. And they show themselves with in a great stature, very similar to what a king might have. They show themselves with private armies in their tombs, and this is something that Senwosret III is done with. The kings before him of the 12th dynasty have tolerated this. He's not going to do it any longer. And as his grim visage shows, he is going to use a carrot and stick approach to get all of these elites to come to his capital. And the way that he does this is probably with a combination of threat and cajolery, bribery, in the same way I would argue that they're doing today in modern day Cairo with a new purpose-built capital, and the same way that Louis XIV did with Versailles. A new capital gets around old systems. It swipes the slate clean. It allows a king to have a new starting area. It puts elites on the back foot. They don't have the networks that they used to have before. And it's a very useful way for a king to break down old and entrenched power and bring power directly to him. And meanwhile, to create a new bureaucratic class that cuts between the elites and the king. The comparison to Louis XIV, Louis XIV, and his construction of Versailles and his turning away from Paris, I think is a wonderful one. And it should surprise none of you that in the same way that a couple of generations after Louis XIV, we see the king's head getting cut off in Paris, a couple of generations after Senwosret III, the very height of his kingship, you see the dynasty utterly collapsing and moving into something of much less distinction than what it was before. Now I have some 6 minutes, which will never do Akhenaten any justice, but will suffice it to say that this king of the 18th dynasty, his contribution to our discussion of authoritarianism is that he changed himself and reclaimed an ideology of kingship by changing the religion such that it impacted his kingship and made him bigger than the god in some ways. So he changed his name from Amenhotep IV, moved into this name of Akhenaten, and created a top-down religious imposition of ideological change that was startling, upsetting, disruptive for the Egyptian population. And only an Egyptian king, you could argue, would be allowed to implement such change. If a leader tried to do this in Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, Syria, I think they would be cut down before they got this far. But in Egypt, which tolerates such authoritarianism, he was able to rule for some 17 years, create a series of shocking and awe-inspiring statues, build his own new capital that was very similar to his name, Akhenaten, for Akhenaten, and create a new understanding of divinity, a divinity that as his reign developed became a kind of monotheism. I would argue the first monotheism on the globe. A very debatable point, but the texts say it quite clearly that this is the God and a God alone, and you can see him moving towards this. It may not have been that way at the beginning of his reign, but it seems to be his end point, and it's towards the end of his reign when you start to see more iconoclasm as well. This god receives new names. We have no time to discuss those names. Akhenaten connects himself, his new god, his aggrandized god, because the Aten did exist before, to a new prosperity gospel. And much of his religious display is of wealth. It's of money. It's of food in excess laid out on altars for everyone to see. He shows himself in his window of appearances, which with his wife and children, throwing out golden baubles to his grateful and loyal elite. This is a very clear, probably the clearest image of political religious co-option that I've ever seen. And yet throughout all of this, we learn from bioarchaeological information that the people who built this new capital were woefully mistreated. And there was a very dirty underbelly to how all of this happened. Now, the hymn to the Aten that he says he created tells us that there is a unique God, there is no other beside him. Again, the monotheism element is debatable, but I will, I've already connected to the iconoclasm against Amun-Re in particular, but I will give you a quote from my book, and I'll read it out loud, which is, I'm not saying that every practicing monotheist is an authoritarian. I am saying that monotheism was specifically invented to support authoritarianism. So that's a bit of a mic drop moment. You guys can mull over that, and we can discuss it in the Q&A after. But I connect the creation of this kind of a loyalty test religion where you're either with him or against him, with authoritarianism specifically. Now, there was an unintended consequence to all of this change as well, and that was the empowerment of a military, which, when the 18th dynasty lineage started to fail after the reign of Tutankhamun, quickly snapped up the reins of power. And we see a series of what could be arguably called military coups moving into the palace environment of Egyptian kingship, which brings us, for the last 2 minutes, we'll give him a little bit more, to Ramses II, whose family is of mercenary origin. And he tells us this outright. There's a well-known stela damaged, but it's called the 400-year stela, which talks about the mercenary origins, the military origins, general origins of his family from the Northeast Delta, maybe even Levantine origins of this family, arguably an immigrant family, coming into Egypt as soldiers, as generals, and then moving into very high positions of power. His father, Seti I, connects himself to arguably Levantine gods. His name, Seti, is Seth, which is akin to Baal in the Levantine system, a very unusual name for a king to have, particularly a king that's supposed to be the son of Osiris. And of course, Osiris was murdered by his brother Seth. I'm not saying that Seth was evil, but it's not something that is as clearly associated with kingship as it does become in the Ramessid period, when we see many more images of Seth than we saw before. War making is the income here. And my main, if we're going to give each king a contribution, like a one-word little phrase, the phrase for Ramses II and Seti I before him is populism. This is a king who is using military base, in some cases a temple base, of lower elites to cut through his balance of power between the high elites and himself. It's also connected to a great deal of nepotism. This, I think, would be the system, this and a little bit of Akhenaten thrown in for fun, would be the system that we connect with most, I think, in our current political regimes around the globe. Ramses II and Seti I, his father, they claimed this kingship ideologically. They had to work very carefully, building temples at Abydos, the ground zero of kingship, to do so. They chose different ways of presenting their kingship. And Ramses II in particular chose quantity over quality. He built everywhere that he could. When you go to Egypt as a tourist today, it often feels like the Ramses the Great show. Because of the amount that he reused, he was able to build quickly and cheaply. He could take the statue of another king, reshape the face, reshape the chest, redo the inscription, and boom, another colossal added to the list. And this was done in temples and religious spaces all over Egypt. And by doing that, he created a celebrity kingship, a kingship that drew the common man to him, that created a base of incredibly loyal followers who were not loyal to a patriarch of their own in their homelands, but were loyal to their king, to their fearless leader, to their warrior, who used war and campaigns to bring spoils back to that loyal base and to build a system that would soon eat itself from the inside out. This is a king who engaged in subterfuge and fake news like we do today, so that the Battle of Kadesh, which resulted in the first documented peace treaty in all of global history, which was certainly a draw at best and a failure at worst, he presents as a mission accomplished, absolute achievement, that he personally saved the day. Only he could have fixed the problem of Kadesh. And he represents this big lie, if you like, all over Egypt and all of his most monumental temples. This is something I think we can really associate with today. The populism connects him to places where his military base would go, such as this temple at Abu Simbel near the Second Cataract in Egypt. And of course, any sort of populism seems to depend on nepotism as well, which is an interesting connection I have yet to explore more. But Ramses II was the first to openly show his sons, to openly show his daughters, to name them, to give them platforms of their own power. Again, the seeds of destruction are shown at the apex of the wave, right before it crests. And in my opinion, this is one of those seeds of the destruction, because it will, and this is the tomb of Ramses II's sons, to give you an idea of the kind of nepotism and openly named power brokers we're playing with. But the aftermath of Ramses II's kingship is a seething wound of different power players, of hundreds of different power players competing with one another, sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of this great Ramses II, all vying for power. And so it is no surprise that you see Egypt breaking into twain and a civil war developing between different relatives of Ramses the Great. So there we are. That's the end of it, and it's 12:03. My goodness. But you can see that my final point is that the authoritarianism, in my view, in the world is alive and well. Each time an authoritarian grows, they sow the seeds of their own destruction, they fall, but it is rebuilt in a bigger form each and every time. We continue to do this. We are no different from the ancient Egyptians. We keep going. The difference, in my opinion, and the last chapter of my book is about this, is that the earth is not getting bigger along with us, and there is a hard out in terms of climate change and climate devastations around the globe, in which this kind of growth, this patriarchal growth, hoarding, and monopolization of resources cannot be sustained. It won't continue if the human race wants to have its own continuance. And I will leave it there on that happy note. Thank you.
Dr. Cooney, thank you so much. I have to say I am deeply impressed that you only overran by 3 minutes, because I normally go a lot more, and I'm never covering as much as you just covered. So many congratulations. That was masterfully done. For people who are watching, if you have questions for Dr. Cooney, we do now have a Q&A session. You can put them in any chat of any platform that you are currently watching on. They are being aggregated and relayed to me, and I will ask Dr. Cooney as many as we can get through in the time that we have. We can go till what, 3:15. So we're just going to go for it. So you spoke about elite empowerment and the diminishment of kingship following the empowerment of those elites. I was wondering if you saw a corollary in American politics at the moment. Have we reached the point where the diminishment is going to happen, or do you think we're not there yet?
Oh, we have our elite kings. When a single person can be worth over $300 billion, and I'm talking about Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, then you don't need to put that person into political power and call them a king. But what do you call somebody like that? How do you understand it? How can, and yet with that $300 billion in the ownership of that one person, we still have an ideology of don't tax me, that benefits him more than anybody else. So I think that, yes, indeed, we are reaching that point, but I don't know if we've reached the top of it yet. It is the most embellished, aggrandized, opulent period. We are sowing the seeds now. What that will actually be, we can all debate. So yes.
Thank you. We have a question. Would Akhenaten, do you think, be considered the worst or most dictatorish despotic pharaohs?
I think that there's the most evidence for that, because Akhenaten, we have the blessing of this capital that he created that was only inhabited for a decade, and then it was bricked up and everyone left. And yes, while they may have destroyed some things or carted away other stones, things were left in a rather pristine condition, so that you can go there as an archaeologist and you can dig up the bodies, as many bioarchaeologists have done, and and you're able to see the conditions that people were working in cemeteries that were set aside for laborers. And those bioarchaeologists, and I'm trying to remember a name right now, and it's not coming to my head. If I remember it, I'll bring it up. But they've found a graveyard of children separated from parents who show the same stress fractures, acute trauma, long-term stress trauma, malnutrition, that show the same conditions, work camp-like conditions that the adults were in. And you wonder, how does that work? I don't think that any DNA analysis has been done. How would you even do it to determine if people are Egyptians or not Egyptians? That gets really tricky with DNA in Egypt as it is. What you can say is that this regime depended on an empowerment of elites and corruption within that, and a breaking of patronage contracts, such that elites were given large amounts of wealth to do with as they want, to skim off the top as they wanted, but without social contracts that were functioning over a long term, because everyone's plopped into a new place, the abuses are able to mount pretty quickly. And people did indeed abuse their power and mistreat those who built that city. So I would say that he's certainly the most hated and reviled afterwards as well. That adds to this reputation of being, as you say, the most despotic of the pharaohs. So I'll go with that as well. I think he was much more ideologically driven and less clever in some ways. But what Akhenaten did has certainly lasted with us to this day. It's something that I think lay dormant, but was around. People discussed, it was talked about so that it could be picked up by some hill country kingship and a bunch of priests who were dedicated to Yahweh. And given the connections between Egypt and the Levant and how close those connections were, I don't think saying something like that is that mad. Though I know there's very little evidence for it, except for some psalms that have very similar phrases from the hymn to the Aten to biblical psalms. But for me, those connections are pretty clear, and it's interesting to see how that religious power can be inviolable and can be used so cleverly to this very day. As I sit in the United States, that is, that many people want to turn back to Christian nationalism, like that.
Yeah.
So,
thank you. So someone is saying that the idea of Egyptian gods, Egyptian kings being gods in flesh is new to them, and it's interesting. And they were wondering how much you think, and it's a difficult question to get a true answer to, but how much you think people believed and bought into this idea that the kings were actually gods, how much the kings themselves actually believed that.
Yeah, we can look at this again, and this is a way that we keep our modern exceptionalism and tell ourselves our myths and keep our own innocence, is by saying, oh, we would never do such simple things. But the Egyptians were very clever about how they did this. They didn't claim to be a great god like Osiris or Amun-Re until after their death. They were not a Necher-Aa, they were a Necher-Nefer. They were a good god. They were something that was in human flesh, that was meant to die and would die at some time, but they were of the gods in a sense. So there were all kinds of mythologies to make this work. And then there were all kinds of ways to reify this. For instance, if you have a good economy, we still do this as part of what's in the book, that we tell ourselves prosperity gospels all the time, that if the economy fails, who do we blame it on? The president. Did the president make the price of milk double? Probably not. Maybe. How connected is that? But we in our simple human minds connect our own economic well-being with that of our kings. Egyptian prosperity from its Nile was more plentiful than a rain-fed agriculture in Mesopotamia or Greece or Rome. And it was easier for Egyptian kings to say, you see this plentiful Nile, I did that. I made this temple, I did the offerings. And those other kings, when the Nile wasn't working, they didn't do the offerings right. You know what? He would be right. Because when the Nile's not working, you have what's called a third intermediate period or a second intermediate period, when there's civil war and all hell is breaking loose and the kings can't build any temples. And so the king is able to say, you see, with your own eyes, when I'm doing it right, you benefit. And everyone's like, you know what, king, it's so true. And so we end up telling ourselves these mythologies. I was just telling my husband today, it's like, you'll put minority students in the United States in schools with less funding and then claim that they don't work hard enough. They just don't work, those people, and it's ingrained in part of their bodies. And that's how you reify racism. And keep that going for hundreds of years in the United States. Whereas if we distributed that money and made those schools better, you wouldn't be able to necessarily say that anymore. So there's all kinds of ways of using money, ideology, building, monumentality to make those claims and to reify it in people's eyes. People are clever and yet not at the same time, but you can work with that. So.
Thank you. And kind of related to that, someone's asking why you think Americans would maybe disagree that the USA could be argued to be like an authoritarian regime like Egypt. What do they think the difference is?
Yeah, I wonder what country you come from, but you're not here. And all you have to do is, go to some place. I grew up in Texas. I'm just reading an article in the New York Times about the Republican Party in Arizona. It's very easy to be a part of this authoritarianism and to yet tell yourself that you're not an authoritarian. It is very, very easy. And I would quote James Baldwin here very loosely by saying that white supremacist patriarchal America has been able to maintain its innocence, that's his word, innocence, by claiming that they are doing what is God-given. They're bringing Christianity to people. They are bringing prosperity. They're bringing jobs. They are doing all of these things that are right and good and necessary. They are working against aberrant sexualities. They're saving babies from abortion. All of these things are taking precedence over the authoritarianism, and all of these moral ideologies are obscuring the actual power grab, the authoritarian power play. And it's very hard for people to see what's actually going on. So I'll leave it there, but I don't think these things are only happening in the United States. I know they are happening in other countries, but it's quite easy for somebody who finds themselves suddenly in the white minority and not believed to be the kind caretaker of their people or the good and noble Christian anymore. They're going to push back harder than they had before, which is why in this moment we find ourselves, in my opinion, in the United States on the cusp of a cold civil war right now, written but with different laws in different states, different taxes, different codes, different cultures, that could soon become hot, that civil war. But there's this civil war, and these differences of opinion are all led through ideology. They're all led through belief. And that is where Egypt helps us the most. How do you get people to believe that you are the good king rather than see behind the curtain that you are the authoritarian? You have to tell them that story instead.
And this actually leads perfectly on to our next question, which I'm afraid everyone will be our last because we have run out of time. But who then has the authority over ideology in ancient Egypt? Is it the pharaoh, or is it the temple priests and priestesses?
This is a wonderful question, and I love it. And I hit upon that many times in the book, but it is a combination of both. It can't just be one top-down situation. In the same way that with authoritarian personalities and leadership around the world, you must rely on your elite who are directly benefiting from the system that you are giving them. And those elites are generally going to be the most pious believers of the ideology that you are selling, because they benefit from it so much and they see its God-given power. So it's like, you could look at Ramses II. I'll just give this one example and then we can end this. But Ramses II, during his reign, you see the publication of a number of underworld books that were not visible before. You see the Book of Earth, you see the Book of the Heavenly Cow and the reign of his father, you see the Book of Day and Night, Book of Caverns, all of these underworld books that were not there previously. The king is not sitting down and creating this ideology himself. He is depending upon a group of intellectuals to create this ideology for him. He then decides how and where to publish it. And he does this in temples as well, not with those sacred books, but with other things, and publishes things that had not been previously published before, to mix things up, to keep people on their toes, but also to allow a lower